we have an area where China really is, as we might expect, an important country. It really is a pretty sizable export power in the world. Now, this is a little bit exaggerated because a lot of Chinese export trade is actually driven by Western multinationals. So even this computer, which is a Chinese-owned product, Lenovo, but certainly an Apple, is designed and created in Cupertino, California, and you send a lot of stuff from other countries to China, and then you ship it back to Western countries. And that counts as Chinese imports and Chinese exports on both sides of the ledger. So it appears like a Chinese export, but in fact it's driven entirely by Western knowledge, Western profits, and Western investment. If you get rid of that process trade, actually Chinese trade goes down by a pretty substantial extent, much greater than in Germany, which is driven much less by that kind of externally driven trade. But even so, China is a relatively important country. The question you have to ask yourself is, does that make China strong, or does that make China weak? So China is extraordinarily dependent on trading, on exporting to other countries around the world today, much more than even other countries are dependent on importing to it. If you look at, and you remember, for those of you who are IR theorists, the theorists like Albert Hirschman, who talks about asymmetrical interdependence and trade dependence, if you look at levels of trade dependence, merchandise exports as a percentage of the total GDP, China is in fact much more dependent on us than we are on them in these trading relationships. Quite substantially more. So if there's any break in trade relations, they get hurt more than we do. So they profit, it's true, but as a political tool, it seems like the power is reversed. Now you might say, well, the Chinese manipulate this trade. They manipulate this trade in order to generate a trade surplus. And that's a powerful thing to do. And it's true they do that. But if you look at how various countries in the world do that, what do you see? You see that the Chinese do that about as well as the Germans. So I think of China as a kind of an Asian Germany. It's about as effective at things like running a trade surplus as the Germans. But who's the really powerful country here that manages to run enormous deficits all the time and get other people to pay for it year in and year out? It's the United States. That's power. Because we have control over the monetary system in a way that other countries don't. This is kind of a garden variety, mid-level power trade surplus. Significant, important, but not superpower stuff. Now you might say, wait a minute. You say, they've accumulated an enormous body of reserves. They have currency reserves, and can't they use these currency reserves? So here are the currency reserves. It's true that China has large currency reserves. These numbers are going down very quickly because China's been defending its currency, but still. The question is, what can they use them for? They can use them to defend their own currency value, and that certainly is an area where China is an appreciably influential country. But most people think they can't use them for offensive purposes. They can't use them to undermine, for example, American financial markets. If you look at the percentage, look at the percentage of American debt that's actually held by China, which is the green, China and Hong Kong together. It's a relatively small sliver of the total. Now people say now, wait a minute. China is establishing itself now as a reserve currency. It's going to be like the US and the euro, dollar and the euro. Guess this is not working. So we read in the papers today that one measure of Chinese power is that it is becoming accepted throughout the world as a reserve currency, and that's going to mean that, as with dollars, other people will accept Chinese currency, and China will be able to pay its debts in currency of its own making. But is Chinese currency really widely accepted today? Here's what the numbers show. This is composition of global foreign exchange reserves in third countries. You've got US dollars and euros. Then you've got the other countries. Sterling, Japanese yen, Canada and Australia, and then China. It's going to be a long, long time before China makes that up. Foreign direct investment. A lot of people worry about Chinese foreign direct investment. They're about to buy the hotel that I'm staying in on the other side of Winter and Linden over there. But outward foreign direct investment stock, it's still true that the US and Europe, particularly Europe, dominates FDI throughout the world. And even flows haven't reversed to nearly the extent we think. Now before we go on to soft power, let's just look at some of the policy uses to which this economic power can be used. So let's talk about foreign aid. Again, read the newspapers. What do you read about? You read about China's Silk Road initiative, that China is giving aid to Central European countries, that they're going to build an enormous trading network from here, from China to Europe, and that this is going to be a major activity in world history, the largest economic scheme on earth. Now, I took one look at this map, and I said to myself, any map that ends in Venice can't be real, right? It has to be somebody's imagination about what Marco Polo did in 1300. So this is all kind of Chinese government propaganda. What you have to ask yourself is, how much money are we talking about? How much money? The answer is $4 billion per year for 10 years. How much does the EU give in development assistance around the world? $71 billion every single year, year in and year out. The European Union is by far the largest grantor of foreign assistance of every kind, public and private, throughout the world. The United States is a distant second, China a very distant third. And you can add another $4 billion on top of that, and you can add another $4 billion from the Asian Development Bank, and it is a drop in the bucket compared to what Europe does every single year. So again, don't believe everything you read in the headlines. One way that this translates into real influence, this enormous European market, is regulatory standards throughout the world. Now, it's hard to get clear numbers comparing regulatory standards throughout the world, but as far as we know, most of the regulatory standards that are set globally are European. They're not American, and they're certainly not Chinese. In fact, this number is completely artificial. It's just really the cases in which China happens to agree with other people. It is Europe that dominates the process of setting regulatory standards. And we know this not just by looking at the standards that get set, but by talking to corporations. Here's the data about Europe and American corporations. This is the probability of success that an EU firm and a US firm will have in influencing a global product standard. And this is how much more likely an EU firm will be to be successful than an American one. So EU firms are 2.5% more likely to say that they're always successful, 6 or 7 times more likely percent more likely to say that they're often successful, 3% more likely to say that they're 50-50. They're much less likely to say that they're sometimes successful, and it's the American firms that say that they're never successful, not the European ones. This is real influence when you think that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all trade in manufactured goods in the world passes through regulatory standards that are increasingly global in nature. All right. Now, that's been lots of detail about economics. So let's talk about some fun stuff, which is soft power, institutions, norms, and cultural practices. So there's an enormous argument out there about this. I've got a shelf full of books about the spread of Chinese soft power, the charm offensive. And I must say, Europeans are terrible salespeople for their own project. I spend a lot of time in Brussels talking to the Europeans about how they can do better PR for the European project, because I believe in it more than they do. So there's an argument to be made that China is increasingly a soft power, superpower, and the US maybe also, but certainly not Europe. But this is most certainly not the case. What's the evidence for it? Let's just look quickly at political institutions, legal norms, education, culture, and entertainment. So, the best thing that Europe has going for it is the EU. Even now, there is no policy tool anywhere in the world, anywhere close to as effective as the EU, at convincing countries to adopt domestic change, political change, economic change, social change, in a direction that a consensus of countries in the region wanted to go, as the European Union. It is far and away the most successful, cost-effective tool. Compared to the Americans spending $2 trillion in Iraq for 15 years with nothing to show for it, European enlargement looks really, really good. And it has expanded out considerably and been enhanced by European neighborhood policy. I know it has a bad reputation, but when a country like Ukraine uses Europe as a focal point for domestic discontent, when a country like Morocco is structuring its domestic reform around an effort to be, to use the language in the treaty, a member of the EU in all but formal terms, this is a substantial achievement. The United States and China have nothing like it. And this is, by far, the greatest achievement. Second, Europe is politically the normative center of where the world is going. If you think about political values, think about constitutional values. What kind of a political society do people want to live in? What do they want to write into their constitutions? What human rights should they have? What expectations should they have about what the state should do for them? It is Europe that is closer to the center of the aspirations of the globe. And you can see this if you look at studies of what people put into their constitutions. So let me just take a very simple example, which is rights. Here's a graph of rights in constitutions, sort of more statist and libertarian conceptions, and few rights and many rights. And you have European states here. So there you have China, there you have the US, there you have a series of European states, and you have the world moving over time. So the trend lines of the world over time are in this direction. So this is a little complicated, but the bottom line of this, which comes from the people who study legal norms, is that the world is moving this way. It's moving toward, let me see if the laser works on this, at least. The world is moving toward where the point of those arrows is over time, in terms of what people put in their constitutions. It's moving away from the US, away from China, toward what a consensus of European countries see as their normative future. All right, education. Here we are in a great university. People always say, you know, I come from Princeton, I used to teach at Harvard. People always say, gee, America's got these great universities, which is true. And they always say, in fact, there was recently a clip in The Economist that said, the United States trains the most foreign students of any, place in the world. Just not true. It's true the United States has the most top 10 universities, although actually if you look at EU countries, and it's surprisingly close. You can add in other Western countries. The important thing to notice here is that China is really not a competitor at all. But the important thing is when you look at how that's used, here's the Economist quote, America attracts the most foreign students thanks to its size and its outstanding universities. Another fallacy of not combining Europe. You combine Europe, and this is what you see. Europe trains the most students, not just other European students, that's what you see here, but third country students as well. Many more than the United States. Anybody who's trying to get a foreign student through the visa process in the United States understands why that number is going down over time between 2000 and 2010 in the United States. Again, Europe is the soft power superpower. The United States is trying to keep up, and China is nowhere to be found. Language. So culture is mediated by language. What about Chinese? In Southeast Asia, the most favorable place. I went and did research. I went to Vietnam. I figured out what they're teaching people. Western languages are 10 times more likely to be taught than Chinese. In fact, Chinese isn't even the second or third or fourth most widely taught language in Vietnam. More Chinese speak English as a second language than speak Chinese everywhere else in the world put together. Chinese is the 7th most commonly taught foreign language in Europe, 5th in the United States, 4th in Australia. China is adapting Western standards, not the reverse. Now let's have some fun. Europe is the global sports superpower. Okay, here's the medal count at the 2012 Olympics. I mean, Europe is just a continent full of studs, right? Fantastic people who go out and win medals. This is true even on a per capita basis. Per million academics, actually those people who study civil society know that much of the civil society activity in Europe is sports groups, and anybody, I spend a month every summer in Umbria, and it's like the local soccer teams out there practicing every afternoon. Europe is actually in an area that, alongside Hollywood, is the area of global cultural globalization. It is Europe that actually is the most influential global player. Consider football, for example, as an industry. We're very proud in America of our parochial type of football, college and NFL football. We market it as hard as we can, but it is nothing like European football in terms of its ability to raise money commercially, and much of that is that European football is a global product. I can watch it on TV in Princeton, New Jersey, just by turning to channel 200 and something, and it comes with my regular package of cable TV in Princeton, New Jersey. Okay, now I'm done, but I want to answer one last argument. Some of you may be thinking, this is all very clever, And yeah, these are all very impressive graphs. But look, China is big. It's got lots of people. It's growing quickly. The Chinese have a pretty, competent government. So sooner or later, we're all finished, right? So yes, 10 years, 20 years, we can argue about how long, but sooner or later, China's going to win, right? Okay, now I want you to think about this. How long? All right, now most of those graphs you look at were like 30 or 50 years. 50 years. I want you to think about 50 years. I want you to think about 1966. 1966. And how long ago that was. Let's go back to 1966. Okay? In 1966, we, the United States, had just entered Vietnam and we thought we were going to win. We just started dropping bombs. In 1966, China was run by Mao, and the revolution was going on, and nobody even dreamed that it would open up to the West. In 1966, the EU had 6 countries in it, and one of them had left the table. And people thought the whole thing was going to collapse. In 1966, they just introduced this as a family car. In 1966, my university's cheerleaders looked like this because they weren't going to let women into Princeton for another 5 to 10 years. In 1966, this was the Batman movie that came out. Not Heath Ledger, all that cool stuff, and pencil and all that, but this one, right? And in 1966, this week, 50 years ago, in Germany, the #1 pop song was this, all right? I'm her yesterday man. Oh, friends, that's what I am. I'm her yesterday man. Oh, friends, that's what I am. That's what I am. Her yesterday man. 50 years is a very long time. Nobody remembers Chris Andrews, and therefore you shouldn't care what's going to happen in 50 years. Thank you. All right, as I told you, I'm very interested in taking questions, and particularly interested in those people who think there are better ways to measure or think about power or influence internationally, because I'm working on a more detailed academic version of this that would take your comments into account. So, please. Yes?
I wanted to ask, you told us how power could be measured, and you told us how power could be measured and everything, but I was asking myself, are you also thinking about the, not ability, the willingness to use the power one has, and the ruthlessness, how to use it in a way that benefits yourself? I thought about this, thinking about Europe is big, but it's also sometimes slow in its process due to democracy, which is good, but it may be less flexible, less agile. And so maybe China, even though it lags a little bit behind, will use the power they have with more force than Europe would want to.
So, I have a bunch of slides on this, but I'm not going to use them. So in the European case, power doesn't generally depend on being a centralized, so the hidden assumption behind your question is that if you're a formally hierarchical, centralized country, you're going to use power more effectively than if you're a decentralized region like Europe. Now, first of all, it's not at all clear that that's true at all. What can happen in a formally hierarchical country is you can't do anything because the different parts of different disagreements still exist within that place, and then they just don't do anything. The United States is a good example of this half the time. But just focusing on Europe, most of the things that I talk about here do not actually depend on centralized, unified Europe in order to achieve. Some of them don't depend on anything. So sometimes Europe, to a surprising extent, is formally centralized. So it is in trade, it is in enlargement, and these things continue apace, and Europe actually has a pretty good track record of agreeing on various things like this. But much of what Europe does is to coordinate, it works like a network to coordinate activity. And then, so sanctions are a good example of this. There's no necessary reason to have sanctions. They could do things unilaterally. It's not an exclusive competence of the European Union. But nonetheless, or there's no, you could decide it would be easy for countries to derail it, but nonetheless, it is surprising the extent to which in foreign policy, European policies are coordinated. 80–90% of what goes on in the UN is coordinated among European countries. Why? Because the level of underlying consensus among European communities, European nations, is remarkably large. Then beneath that, you have a lot of areas where European countries simply have the same policies without coordinating them at all. So take standardization. Standardization takes place largely within international standardization bodies where corporations go and hash these things out privately, or where governments are represented. Sometimes it's the EU, but often it's not. But nonetheless, they're sufficiently coordinated by virtue of the common experience of having been in a European market that they pursue common policies even though Brussels never coordinates those policies. And then even below that, Europe is a continent of highly interdependent democracies. They're 5 times more interdependent than any other democracies anywhere in the world. They're all democratic, so they're not going to fight with each other. And they have, at least within the EU realm, essentially gotten rid of any kind of a territorial conflict that's going to cause war between member states. And the result of that is that they don't need to use any of their power resources to deal with that, which is quite different than the case of a country like China, which faces on every side countries with which it might have a potential conflict, and faces within forces with which it might have potential conflict. So for all those reasons, Europe, I think, can reasonably be treated as being unified in its policies, even when it's not. And I think the view that Europe is incapable of acting because it is disunified is widely exaggerated. There are a few areas in which I think it's true. Investment is one. But there are actually many fewer than people think. And they don't, and I didn't include them here. And that's why when you get to the end of each of those sections, I say, so let's look at in the real world what they're doing. How much foreign aid they're giving. Who's sending troops? How many standards are they setting internationally? What you see is exactly what those numbers would lead you to believe you should see. Because actually this power does translate into effective action. This is, I mean, it's a lesson for international relations theory, if you want, that power in the 21st century is not coercing somebody to do something or being an international institution that tells you you have to do it.